Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Victims of Communism's Memorial Foundation series on communism and film. I'm Ken Pope, the Director of Academic Programs for VOC. It's my pleasure to introduce today's event. The arts and literature, and especially film, has the power to reach millions of people by telling compelling stories that resonate deeply and emotionally with the viewers. Today, we're going to explore two such works. The first is Armando Iannucci's 2017 film, The Death of Stalin, and the second, Andrei Konchalovsky's 1991 film, The Inner Circle. Two very different works. The first is a rather dark satire surrounding the death of Stalin, the ruler Stalin, and the second, a more sober film depicting the tragic life of Stalin's projectionist, but also Stalin's death. And each also have a good look inside the inner circle of what took place around that period of time in the Soviet leadership. And it also highlights the suffering that the people who lived under such an oppressive system endured. Leading today's conversation are our two panelists. The first is Dr. Flag Taylor. Flag serves as on VOC's academic council and is associate professor of government at Skidmore College. He holds a PhD and Master of Arts in Political Science from Fordham University and a BA from Kenyon College. Flag's specialty is the history of political thought and American government. He's the author or co-author of numerous works on communism and totalitarianism. Next is Titus Teixeira. Titus is the executive director of the American Cinema Foundation and host of the AFC Movie Podcast. He's also a film critic for Law and Liberty and the Act and Power blog. He's a contributor to Modern Age and the culture columnist for the European Conservative and for Return. He has a series of great reviews on a wide variety of films, and his views and Flags have challenged some of my thinking on how I look at films today. Titus and Flag have started a series of conversations on cinema, communism, and totalitarianism going back to 2017. Through discussions on films from Russia, Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic and the United States, they provided a good body of work and critical resources for educators and for the public about communism's tyranny, and they make the case that artists are also important public educators. One quick admin note before I turn it over to Flag. Our panelists will discuss the films for about an hour, and we'll save 20 to 30 minutes at the end for your questions. So please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature at the bottom to submit your questions. So once again, welcome to everybody, and we look forward to the conversation. Flag, over to you.
Thanks, Ken. I'm glad to be here. Titus, hi, how are you?
Hello, Flag. Hello, Ken. Very good to be doing this again with you too.
So as Ken said, Titus and I have been doing podcasts on the subject of communism and totalitarianism more generally since about 2017. We've covered over 20 films at this point, so I encourage you to check out Titus's podcast, the American Cinema Foundation Movie Podcast, if you like what you hear today. And then also a reminder, we did a previous conversation sponsored by the Victims Communist Foundation in June, and we took up two films, the HBO series Chernobyl, and then the film by Andrei Konchalovsky from 2020, Dear Comrades. And so today we're taking up these two films that both revolve around the death of Stalin. First, we're going to talk about the death of Stalin. As Ken said, this came out in 2017. Interestingly, it was widely praised. I was kind of doing some searching this morning for reviews from kind of major cultural journals like the New Yorker, New York Times, and then magazine reviews, from journals from both the left and the right. And it was widely praised. I think it was, I couldn't remember where there was such universal agreement on a film by critics from across the political spectrum. And so I remember back in 2018, I was excited to see it and very disappointed once I watched it, but then was a little glad to hear Titus had the same reaction that I did. And so we've been kind of the lone dissenters. And so I don't know about lone, but we felt very much in the minority in our view of the death of Stalin. So we wanted to kind of talk about why we have this critique, and then compare it to a film that we think is a much better treatment of Stalin, this Konchalovsky film from 91 called the Inner Circle. So Titus, let's just start with the plot of Death of Stalin. This is rewatching it again in preparation for the webinar. I didn't remember how boring it was. I I really think that there isn't much of a plot. There's a kind of hint of a plot in terms of this conflict of the people struggling for power in the wake of Stalin's death. And eventually you have this conflict that emerges primarily between two figures, Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the NKVD, and Nikita Khrushchev. But that conflict really doesn't gain steam, I would say, until about 2/3 into the movie. And before that, I think it's a kind of series of portraits of these figures, but there isn't much of a kind of action to move things forward. So I don't know. It just came out the second time around much more than the first, that I didn't really see any driving action in the movie. So I wanted to get your reaction to the plot of the movie initially.
Yes, Flag, I think you're right about this. It's, I think, such a shocking idea, have a black comedy set around Stalin's dying body, that maybe the Iannucci thought you don't need that much of a plot. Maybe it'll keep the attention of the audience enough. And perhaps he also thought that people might want to laugh at this, but they're not going to sign up for a history lesson. So you don't really need to characterize the various members of the Politburo that you keep seeing running in and out of rooms in the movie. And indeed, the result is, I think, if you're very frivolous, it's very amusing to see these old men with medals or important functions or what have you run in and out of rooms doing, some kind of slapstick, I guess, a bit of physical comedy here and there. But beyond that, all you really have is this plodding characterization of Beria, former NKVD boss, as the bad guy, and Khrushchev as a reformer, more moderate guy. And it's, of course, preposterous, but that's all there is to be said for why things are even happening. Why are we looking at this? What's going on screen? Where is it going? It's Beria plotting against Khrushchev, and Khrushchev slowly managing to figure out some way to plot back against him and eventually to win. And at the end, they arrest Beria and he gets shot. And in a way, even there, the movie works hard to make Khrushchev seem like a nice guy. It's just a scuffle, some bad thing happens, and some soldier just shoots Beria, and that's the end of that. So somehow Khrushchev actually manages to have his cake and eat it too. He outmaneuvers this master of terrors, espionage, and murder, Beria, but also doesn't have to get his hands dirty either. It's astonishingly crazy.
Yeah, good. So let's get into kind of the pretensions that the movie has to comedy. I was very hopeful when I watched the movie initially, because that first 10 minutes or so, the scene at the concert house where the guy gets the call from Stalin, and he's told Stalin's, not from Stalin, from a secretary, and he says Stalin's going to call in 17 minutes, and there's this comic interaction between his assistant, and then he discovers that Stalin actually wants a recording, but they haven't been recording, so he has to get the people to come in and start. All that is very funny and very well made. The actor who plays this kind of chief of the Moscow concert hall is very good, but then it goes downhill, I thought, and so I wanted to talk about why we both think that it doesn't turn out to be as funny of a movie as it wants to be. And so I'll give you one thought of mine, and maybe we can go back and forth and kind of talk about the extent to which communism is or is not a kind of fruitful source of comedy. I think it can be, for sure. And I would say the biggest reason is that comedy, all the way back to Aristophanes, has been something that results from grand human pretensions, right? We sort of forget our humbleness and our earthy nature. And so anything that sort of makes human beings kind of look silly. The contrast between who they think they are, what they think they're doing, and then how kind of reality intervenes is funny. And communism, of course, is ripe for this, because you can have no grander ambitions, right, than the communists did. They wanted to create a new human being, to transform human nature, to move us into this final stage of history, right? This is serious business, grand ambitions. And so showing the contrast between the pretensions and the reality could be very funny. The problem with this film, I think, Death of Stalin, is that you never see the pretension. You don't see the ambition. You don't get a sense of this grand experiment, even in word, about what they were up to. And so that's sort of the initial reason I think it fails, is because you don't get a sense of the contrast. You just get the sense of them being inept and a little bit, pathetic, frankly. So please, respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. The opening scene at the concert house is just a concert. They're just doing a piano concerto, Mozart. And that reminds us, of course, of the cultural pretensions of the USSR, the ballet, the classical composers, and the virtuoso soloists, and of course chess, and so on. These pretenses that the Soviet regime is somehow culturally superior to democracy, or to America specifically, because of these high arts. And then it turns out that Stalin wants a copy of the concerto performance, and they just have to do it again because they had failed to record. They didn't know they should be recording. It was just a radio event. And all of a sudden, what had been an attempt to escape, I guess, from tyranny, to have a beautiful evening, just listen to Mozart, forget about Stalin. Turns out you can't. Stalin has them rehearse what they had been doing for pleasure, and all of a sudden they do it with terror. Everything that was spontaneous or natural even now is fake. It's not just because it's being rehearsed, but because it is done in fear. They have to applaud out of fear something that they had applauded willingly, spontaneously before. And that is a very good portrait of how tyranny can falsify ordinary experience, how it can force people to live in a mannered way that's made much uglier by fear. And it suggests that the movie will somehow look at this contrast between, on the one hand, the demands of a tyrant who is really a voice of terror and a figure of terror even in people's minds. And on the other hand, the expectations that people might have that communism maybe is cultivated, communism maybe is more humane. Or it seems like it's going to poke through the ideology of communism, to which liberals in Europe and America were very much susceptible throughout the many bloody decades of the tyranny. But then it suddenly turns into something completely different. The opening scene is based on an anecdote from a book of memories that is somehow redone in an ugly way by Iannucci about this famous pianist, Yudina, who is supposed to have put a note insulting to Stalin and affirming her religious faith. She was very orthodox, in the sleeve of such a concert disc. There's no evidence that it ever happened, but it's a very interesting story. But of course, the woman turns out in the movie not to be a famous pianist, but a hot babe. And she turns out not to be a Christian, but to want money. And if that were not enough caricature, then it turns out that this message rather in the disc is what got Stalin killed. So it makes this suddenly bombastic claim that somehow art is going to get rid of tyranny, which is of course completely crazy. But I suppose you could say it speaks to the arrogance of the movie makers, which is immediately confirmed when we see that all the somewhat terrifying men of the Politburo around Stalin are presented like bumblers and bunglers. They're scared, they're silly, they're ridiculous old men running around without purpose. And everything descends from what seemed like it would be a very interesting attack on ideology and the susceptibility to believe in communist ideology wherever people did believe it, for as much as they did it. And it turns into something else, into a kind of a parody of communism, where it turns out nobody's really such a thing to worry about. And communist evil, Stalinism, is incarnated in Beria, who then is outfoxed constantly and himself becomes a figure of ridicule. And instead of what we had expected or were led to expect by the opening sequence, somehow this turns into a game of cat and mouse between Khrushchev and Beria. And at the end of it, the mouse turns on the cat, Beria. And I don't know why people would think that Khrushchev is a good guy, you root for him to win. But that would seem to be the, so to speak, the ideology of the movie. And it seems to be both completely something that comes completely out of the blue and something that completely ruins any seriousness, since it turns communism into something that's nothing to worry about, nothing to fear, and ultimately nothing to care about.
Yeah, I think that's very good. I wanted to highlight one aspect of your remarks just there, where you were talking about kind of the performative aspects of ideology, right? That living in one of these regimes forces you to mouth these phrases, and the movie does occasionally well, right? It shows you the ideology merges with the Stalin cult. So there are a few funny moments that touch on that. So I love the scene with Khrushchev and his wife, and Khrushchev his wife rather, is going over some notes that he had made in a conversation. It turns out the notes are trying to kind of navigate and predict what Stalin would find funny by what he found funny in the past, and striking the subjects, right, that he thinks might be off limits. And there's what he, Khrushchev and his wife have this back and forth, and they can't quite read the writing in the notes, and that's very good. And then there's a funny scene with Molotov, where Molotov and I think it's Khrushchev and Beria are both denouncing Molotov's wife, who had been in prison, and then it turns out Beria had freed her. So then we bring her out. And so in the span of like 30 seconds, they've been denouncing this woman as an enemy of the people. And then next minute they're hugging her and saying, "Oh, you were unjustly accused." And, that's sort of well done in terms of evoking the kind of crazy pressures people are under. But those moments are not very many in the movie. And as you suggested, I think the movie ends up trying to make kind of general ineptness, petty infighting, kind of the lack of the ability to respond to events, all of that is made to be the source of the humor. I mean, even down to a scene where they're trying to leave Stalin's dacha in their separate cars, and the cars are going to run into each other. Ha ha! Isn't that funny? They can't even figure out how to leave the dacha. And I think it just makes it gets tiresome very quickly. At least it did for me. And as you suggested, I also think it just makes the awfulness of communism safe. It doesn't get to the core of why it was dangerous and how it was dangerous. It ends up trying to get us to laugh at these people because they're so silly and inept. But of course, as you suggested, right? I mean, the Soviet Union was a giant empire that ruled a third of the globe, and undertook to unleash its power to do horrible things and transform the country. I mean, if they were all bunglers and everything was so silly and contemptible, right, we wouldn't have had the century that we had. So I think that in that aspect of the movie, it's sort of, I would say, genuinely irresponsible and sort of how it kind of urges viewers to look at communism. last aspect of the movie I wanted to talk about before we jump to a much better movie, I think, is just the problem of evil in the movie. As you've explained, much of the movie revolves around Lavrentiy Beria. He was chief of the NKVD for many, many years. He is a uniquely evil figure for lots of reasons. One of which is that he was known to have gone around Moscow and taken young women and raped them, and had his underlings give them flowers, and if they accepted them, that was supposed to go off the illusion, right, that they were consenting to this liaison. The movie alludes to this pretty explicitly. I mean, it doesn't focus. I wouldn't say it focuses on it and highlights it, but alludes to it, and I don't know. I don't know whether it wants us to stare at it for too long, or what it wants us to think of this. But I just think it sort of handles that episode in a very irresponsible way. And more generally, right, the movie talks about this, as you said, it revolves in part around the struggle between Khrushchev and Beria, and that turns into a struggle between the NKVD and the army. And so at various points in the movie, when one of these factions is starting to emerge victorious, people are shot, and they're shot in the head. And it's just not, it's not funny. And it treats in a kind of lighthearted way something that's pretty darn serious, especially for the people who experience this kind of tyranny. And I guess I don't want to suggest that these dark things can't be treated comically, but I sure don't think they can be treated comically in the way that Iannucci does here.
Yeah, this is it's a very tricky thing to deal with. You could say that Iannucci is part of the last wave of liberals who would go around saying that you should be able to laugh at everything, that everything is funny, everything is an object of comedy, which is not self-evident. Why ought you to laugh at everything? It would seem to suggest that there might not be anything that's really funny, and there might not be anything, therefore, that's not funny. That's that attitude very quickly turns this sort of political satire into an inept caricature, into the kind of jokes that you could expect kids to make, since they have no idea who these people were or why it matters that they murdered millions of people. At the same time, you can see the director walking this very sophisticated path where he knows that Beria was a rapist, and so he has him keep talking about how he rapes women who are desperate to save their husbands, whom he has put in the Lubyanka. And then you are shown him with a child, and indeed he had a reputation for raping children, as you suggested, in Moscow, and murdering them. And then the scene is so contrived that he does not get to rape this young woman. And that's a crazy thing to put in any kind of comedy whatsoever. But it's also, there's a kind of rottenness to the movie that comes from its sophistication. Most people have no idea who Beria is. If they know who Beria is, they have no idea that he was a rapist. If they think, people did terrible things to him, they would not have insisted on having a child in the scene because they would have had no idea. And so most of the audience has no idea why that is there. But then why is it there? It's if it's a joke that nobody gets, so they're not going to laugh at it. If it's not a joke, it's a kind of, you would say, testimony to the historical record. You got to tell the truth about Beria, that is in that one case. Then it's no longer a matter of comedy. It's some other kind of mission to tell the truth, which of course is not how the movie is made. Many events are altered, made up, historical timelines changed, but above all, the political idea that Khrushchev is a good guy and Beria is a bad guy is absolutely insane. So it doesn't fit anywhere in the movie. And I think it shows this problem with the director who's aware what the press is going to say, he's aware what the critics or institutions that play arbiter of taste will say about this or that thing, what academics will say about the historical record. And he writes, so to speak, to accommodate their opinions or prejudices with no concern with to what does this say about the movie? What does it say about the period? And of course, what does it say about the relationship between art and tyranny? There is this great cynicism that suggests that in one sense, art will destroy tyranny. You can demystify Stalin, you can demystify the Politburo, but in another sense, it ends up with something almost entirely nihilistic because it destroys the power of art to tell the truth. By the end of it, it turns out that not even in 2017 can liberals tell the truth about communism. You will not learn much about Khrushchev. The political idea is all lies. Anybody who knows anything about Khrushchev knows that he was the man behind the missile crisis in Cuba and the Hungarian Revolution put down in blood in 56. This is what the audience is intended to cheer for and to hope comically he will win so that he can do these monstrous things. Does this make any sense whatsoever? Yanush is a mediocrity, but the problem in itself is indeed, as you suggested, very, very serious, because comedy should have somehow the power to make fun of even certain evil things, but it's not clear how to do it. That is, the comedy has been restrained in certain ways by civilization. Aristophanes made fun of demagogues at risk to his own life, but that's not the same thing as tyranny. A tyrant you can't make fun of and live. Iannucci can only reproduce the cowardice of Cold War liberals, since he does all this from a position of safety, looking to win awards and all sorts of prestige. He's not risking anything. Nobody in here is risking anything. Everybody knows they will be applauded and approved to some extent, precisely because what they're doing is utterly mediocre, although it is polished. So it's not, in fact, making fun of tyranny. It's not showing any kind of human courage, and it's not telling the truth about tyranny either. Artistically speaking, just think of ancient tragedy or of Shakespeare. If you deal with tyranny, it's going to be a tragedy. It would be perhaps something like Macbeth or something like Richard III. It's not going to be all that funny. Now, of course, those tragedies show the ugliness, the lies, and the terror, but they do not attempt to laugh at them. Perhaps there is something rotten in the perspective of this elite mockery that you're supposed to somehow know who all of these people are, but not care about who any one of them is. You're supposed to have an acquaintance with the situation in Moscow in 53, but you're not supposed to care about it. There's something deeply dishonest about that. It's sophisticated, but at the same time, very ignorant. You're not supposed to care about what's true and what's not here, strangely enough. And so I think somehow that rottenness of perspective, that moral rot, has made it has made the man eager to, so to speak, laugh at tyranny without asking himself, to what extent is that possible? When is that going to really be a good idea politically or intellectually? Does it make for good comedy? And so you end up not learning anything about tyranny, strangely enough.
Yeah, it either makes it so distant that you can be self-satisfied that, oh, we're so much better, or it just assimilates the experience of inept bungling to any sort of ordinary inept bureaucracy. So it sort of somehow falls in the trap of not avoiding either of those extremes, and I would say both of them make communism unintelligible ultimately. So let's turn to the much better film about Stalin, 1991, The Inner Circle, directed by Andrei Konchalovsky, again the director that Titus and I talked about with the VOC in June of this movie, Dear Comrades. I'd be interested to hear, Titus, which you think is the superior movie. Maybe we can get to that at the end. Interesting fact about this movie, I noticed that it came out the day before the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is interesting little detail. Titus, why don't you just take us through the plot of the film? It focuses on these two ordinary characters. I mean, it obviously touches on Stalin and some of the higher ups, but unlike the death of Stalin, it tells the story from the perspective of, I guess, who we would call somewhat ordinary folks.
Yes, I think at the outset I should add that The Inner Circle is a true story. It's the story of this man, Ivan Sanchin, who was the projectionist for Stalin, who watched a lot of reels, news, movies, all sorts of things. And of course, as some of the viewers might know, Stalin was also the film critic in chief of the Soviet Union and art critic in chief, etc., etc., etc. But this story is the complete opposite of the death of Stalin, although it is also about the death of Stalin, because it depends on the audience sharing to a certain extent the earnestness of the protagonist, Ivan Sanchin. He's a peasant. He got to somehow into the army, and then in a technical department, he's an ace projectionist. That's what he's really good at. That's what he's kind of proud of. And to some extent, that's what the Soviet Union means to him. You can do certain jobs. You can achieve certain things that didn't exist before. It's kind of technological progress, if you will. And he has made it into what we are told is the KGB. For the sake of the viewers, it's just called the KGB, although it did not have that name until after the fall of Beria in 1954. The secret police of the USSR from the Cheka onwards during the revolution kept changing its names, and of course the people at the various leading levels kept massacring each other, as you might expect from the communist tyranny. But it's a movie made for Western audiences, so it's just called the KGB. Ivan is part of it, but he is not involved in espionage. He is not involved in anything except his narrow technical expertise, which he's very proud of, and which earns him the selection to be the personal projectionist of Stalin. In some cases, technological skill is admired, and it has a kind of political neutrality. And at the beginning of the movie, this is 1939 or so, this works both ways. Ivan is himself neutral. He has no awareness of the ugly side of communism. When he meets his co-workers in the projection room and around there in Stalin's entourage, he sees that they are jaded, corrupt in certain ways, but he's an earnest, enthusiastic, idealistic guy, doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut, is scared and awed by everything, but not at all wary or careful. And by the end of the movie, he ends up like them to a very large extent. A broken man, almost soulless. It's so to speak, when you see the movie a second time, you realize, seeing these other people around him from the KGB, that's where he's headed, and he does not know. The movie is full of these sorts of notes of a terrible future, that this guy who is happy-go-lucky, in a way like the audience, ignorant of the evil ahead, is going to end up corrupted by it. And he becomes very proud of himself because of this new job and responsibility. And he thinks it might lead to good things for him and his wife, who is also a peasant. At the beginning of the movie, we'll find out she doesn't even have a working permit because she's a newcomer to the city. They're in love, Ivan and Anastasia. In the beginning, they get married and they hope for some kind of Soviet future for themselves. But instead, this leads to terrible things. In the movie moves from 1939 to 1941 to Hitler's invasion of Russia. Much of the government flees Moscow in terror. And this includes Ivan, who secures a place for him and his wife. But instead of leading him to safety and prominence, as he is proud of himself to be part of the inner circle of the people who have direct access to Stalin, who see the man he continuously calls the master, Instead, it ends up with Beria raping his wife and indeed taking her as a sex slave, essentially, for while dismissing Ivan himself back to Moscow. And from then on, the movie becomes very grim. He sees her come back, pregnant on the one hand, and on the other hand, a cynical, broken woman. They attempt in a desperate way to reconcile, since they loved each other honestly, but the woman cannot deal with her husband, who obviously loves her, but is too corrupt by his earnestness, by his willingness to believe in Stalin, and after all, in the people who treated her like a sex slave. And she commits suicide in desperation after saying, Satan is in the Kremlin. That's who's ruling us. And it's quite heartbreaking. Parallel to this, there is a young girl, one of the next door neighbors, a Jewish family. They are arrested by the KGB, let's call it, and their girl is sent to an orphanage where she's taught to believe at the same time that Stalin is great and provides for the fatherland, for the people, including her, and that she is evil because she's a Jew and the Jews are conspirators against the communist order and future. And so it's a shocking mixture. Anastasia, Ivan's doomed wife, cares for the girl, tries to save her, tries to adopt her. Ivan won't do it because she's politically compromised, the parents being executed. And he tries angrily to get his wife to stop caring for this girl, but the wife won't. Anastasia loves her and promises the young Katya that she will always take care of her. And however, she cannot. She's abducted and she kills herself. And we only see Katya as a teenager grown up come to pay her respects to Ivan, because in Anastasia's telling, in the dead wife's telling, he was always a good and kind man. She had always presented him that way, not as an apparatchik, not as a communist insider in the inner circle. And Ivan, in a desperate way, tries to help this girl out for the sake of his wife, and possibly, you could say, to save his soul, to redeem himself in some way. And the movie ends with this shocking scene at the death of Stalin. There are massive gatherings of people mourning, trying to get to see the dead old master, and 1,500 people died, we are told, in those crowds. And Ivan saves Katya when he sees her being pressed and ready to collapse. And that's the conclusion, and that's the little dignity, you could say, that he manages to save for himself. And Katya is desperate that she should go see this man who is the author of all her horrors, Stalin. And there is a vision of the way Stalin drove Russia mad, the power of a tyranny, this kind of technology, and this kind of ideology and propaganda, that people were desperate that they lost the man who was the author of their horrors.
Yeah, so that's a great outline of the plot. I would add too, thematically, it has force because it evokes a particular aspect of communism under Stalin, which is in a way a great mystery, which is most people were touched either directly or indirectly by Stalin's tyranny in some way, right? Everyone had a relative or a friend of a friend at minimum, right, who would have been arrested or lost their job or sent to the gulag, right, because of some politically incorrect opinion expressed, or harboring a Jew or something, and so people would have experienced in a very visceral way the tyranny's effect on their lives. On the other hand, at the end of the movie, right, as you said, there's this outpouring of love and support for Stalin. People literally being trampled, hundreds of people being trampled, trying to get to the funeral, to get one glance at Stalin. So the movie, I think, tries to penetrate that mystery and get viewers to really think about what the corruption of the private looks like. I mean, you start right away at the very beginning of the film, as you said, in this very ordinary basement flat, which is carved up amongst 5 or 6 different family units. So Anastasia and Ivan have one room. The Gubelmans, right, the parents of the young girl Katya, they are the father is arrested in the first scene. There's an old gentleman professor. There's an older woman, and so everyone's kind of listening in to everyone else is doing, and there's kind of, you can see the petty jealousies at work because no one has the kind of privacy that one would expect, and being able to kind of live your family life and not worry about uttering the wrong phrase. And so the movie starts with that in a way, ends with that because he has to, Ivan, as you suggested, is put in the position of having to do right by Katya, this young, this orphan whom he had rejected because he knew it would be politically dangerous for him. And, he feels guilty because his wife was the one who embraced her role as a kind of surrogate mother for this poor orphan. And this is all made even more difficult, right? Because the as you said, the orphan is then, poor Katya is, the cult of Stalin is inculcated into her to such an extent that she's willing to forsake her parents and call her parents enemies of the people and say, Stalin is the one who's going to save us. And Konchalovsky does a wonderful job of kind of never making it perfectly obvious if the people who are uttering these phrases about Stalin really have convinced themselves that they believe it, or they're just trying to hang on to something that they can believe in, and that can sort of ground their belief in this grand Soviet experiment. So it gets you to really think through how a tyrannical regime can take so much away from so many people, but ultimately people will still persevere in glorifying, deifying this leader who had kind of oriented their lives for, most of their adult lives, for many of them, or for their whole lives for some people, right? Stalin ruled from the mid 20s through the early 50s. And so it gets you to grapple with something that's very, very serious and very, very difficult to kind of wrap your head around if you haven't experienced it yourself. And thankfully, most of us who haven't, weren't unfortunate enough to live in Mao's China or Ceausescu's Romania, for that matter, didn't have to wrestle with this.
Yes, I think that's a very important point to realize, that looking at the story from the perspective of fairly ordinary people in Russia is essential to realizing how the tyranny worked on people, and how people who were not themselves cynical, evil, or even mere opportunists could be corrupted, and it all ends up in this frenzy. The violence of the mob at the death of Stalin, I think, cannot be ascribed simply to the love they had for Stalin. It must come ultimately much more out of fear. And so you could say, how is it possible to combine fear and love in this way? That's what you see in Ivan, and in a different way in Katya, as they're different generations of the before World War II and after World War II Russian people. And I think they're both intended to be, to some extent, typical. Ivan is so powerful as a witness because it's his story, it's a true story. Katya, only because of how typical it is for a child to have been, to such an extent, raised under control of tyranny, that she is taught from earliest youth to hate her parents. And that in a way she still tries to retain her humanity, in her case, by loving this woman who was the only person who ever showed her affection, Anastasia, and then extending that to Ivan. out of because Katya, like Ivan, desperately needs something to love that is not horrifying. And so in a certain way, they try to reconstruct, exactly as you were suggesting, private life, something that belongs to them because they are human beings, not because it comes with orders or ideology or the fear that if you do otherwise, you will be punished. There must be something in people's lives that they retain as their own. And Ivan indeed jumps out of the NKVD truck and risks his own life in the push to save this teenage girl. And you could say that's the only really human thing he does in all the movie. For once, he shows something close to courage. Ivan is something of a conformist. It's hard to be otherwise. He's in awe of the power in the organization that has been there all his life. The evidence of the power of these, of the KGB, of the Soviet Communist Party is just overwhelming. And you see that he's not a good man. He's not. He doesn't have much to recommend him morally, but he's not an evil man either. He's not vicious, that is to say. He doesn't. He's proud of becoming part of the inner circle of people who are around Stalin and in some sense are privileged, but he does not abuse that privilege. He looks to offer his wife some kind of life, but that's about it. He does not look for wealth or anything else, really. So he's very modest, but he wants to believe that the master Stalin, that Soviet rule, is to the good. And that is enough to poison everything else in his life. And there is this shocking scene in a movie that is very earnest, where after his wife's suicide, he has a nightmare in which he meets Stalin himself in the streets outside his apartment. And he goes there with the same eager adoration. And Stalin asks him, "Is there anything wrong? Any problems?" And he just lies. No, everything's great. Everything is great. The revolution will thrive. Even now, he's putting this sort of ideological account of events above what he has experienced, the loss of the only person he ever loved. And Stalin at that moment turns into his bad conscience in his dream. He says, "You're lying to me. Your wife just died. I know everything." Taking literally the omniscience claim of ideology of propaganda and of its correlative, of course, the secret police. And so for him to be able to feel guilty, somehow this still involves Stalin. Even his dreams are not really his own. In a certain way, like the whole movie, that the dream sequence is hard to take because it requires that we be earnest, that we not attempt to be too sophisticated, too knowing about this, try to see the situation from the point of view of these people who are not all that impressive. But precisely because they're ordinary people, they are good evidence of how this could, this kind of tyranny could overpower even people's private lives and then their thoughts and ultimately their dreams, so to speak. I think that's a truth worth acknowledging, and I am surprised how well Konchalovsky could dramatize it. As you said, the movie came out just before the collapse of the USSR. It was produced after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was one of the early artistic statements. Therefore, it's in English with an Anglo-American cast. And Russians. And it's obviously intended for the West, hence calling the NKVD, etc., KGB, because everybody knew the word KGB. They didn't know when it was founded or what have you, but they knew what it meant, that this was the secret police of the USSR. So it might seem in making such choices that it's somewhat didactic, but I think it was not. I think it was a very good attempt to show people what it had been like in the USSR, what people went through there morally and psychologically, and how they could become so corrupt and therefore that these are realities that would have to be acknowledged. You could say that people like Katya would have been retirees or just at the age of retirement when communism fell. They had gone through that all their lives. It's very important to understand what it was like for people like that, given that Soviet communism fell, the USSR fell, the evil empire fell, but all those people were still there. And they could not, fully transform their experience overnight. It's one thing to get rid of the politics, it's another thing to get rid of its consequences. So I think Konchalovsky was doing a great public service in trying to show people what it was like to go through this tyranny. And it is ultimately a very sophisticated teaching, but it starts with this earnest couple, Ivan and Anastasia, who are not at all aware of the terrible things they're going through. She is, the movie insists that this may seem old-fashioned to people today, but that men are more believers in honor and in professionalism, a job. Hence, Ivan is very proud of being an ace projectionist. It's the best of his kind and knowing the job inside and out and putting film through the machine and starting it with his eyes closed. Very demonstrative. And at the same time, he has the bust of Stalin that he can never let go of. He likes Defense Minister Voroshilov since he's part of the army, but then he's disgraced, and so out goes the portrait. This natural manly intention to be competent at the job and to have a kind of honor, a kind of political dignity is what corrupts him so terribly. These are not bad things, but under a tyranny, it could get really very bad. And on the other hand, Anastasia is much more on the natural side. Again, this may seem old-fashioned to people, but she instinctively wants to save this girl of the Jewish family that's arrested and executed, because she sees the innocence of the child, and she wants somehow to save that. She wants to be a mother, of course, at the same time. That's one of the symbols in the movies. It's not just that Anastasia is raped and she's bearing Beria's child. Is that her husband is impotent somehow. They didn't have a child in the years they were married. His dedication to Stalin has rendered him sterile, is the symbolism there. Just like, of course, outside their mezzanine, you keep seeing cows going to the slaughter. That is not at all subtle. It's not insisted on, but of course, it's a depressive suggestion about the truth of the matter that all of these people, the Russian people, are cattle taken by Soviets to the slaughter by Stalin and by this regime he led. So there's a lot to the symbols and the imagery in the movies that we could talk on much beyond what we have said. But of course, much also has to be left to our audience to watch the movie and think through these things for themselves and notice that artistry does not require cynicism, and it might be better to confront evil from an earnest position that leaves you open to heartbreak than from a knowing position that somehow reassures you that you're in charge of all these people, that they're no problem, they're just puppets on a stage for you.
Yeah, the two films present quite different portraits of Beria, of course. You don't see the actual rape take place in the inner circle, but you watch Beria get this woman drunk, and she naively doesn't quite understand what's going on, I think, until it's too late. And then she, as you said, Ivan comes back to Moscow, and she stays in Kubyshev, where the government stayed for about a year. And so it treats Beria's evil in a much less cynical way, and in a forthright way, I would say. The other beautiful scene I wanted to mention, maybe we can end on this, Ken, and then start opening up to questions. I guess two scenes that are linked. One is after about 2 years as the projectionist for Stalin, Ivan is invited to a meeting with one of the higher ups in the NKVD, and the NKVD guy says, well, you haven't shown any signs of patriotism or political consciousness recently. I haven't received any reports from you on, people who might be enemies. And I've also noticed that your wife has been visiting the daughter of these two enemies. And he immediately doesn't hesitate, right? He says, I warned Anastasia against this. And so right there, you see him forsaking what his wife won't forsake, right? He wants to push the claims of the private as far away as he can, and keep his love of Stalin pure. And there's this contrast, or sort of repeated highlighting last half hour of the film, right, between the statue that Ivan finds of Stalin on the street and puts in his closet, love for Stalin, and that seems to be more important to him than his wife, and that ultimately is what he wrestles with and can't overcome in that final scene when he decides that he finally does need to embrace the claims of Katya. The scene that I found most moving in the film is near the end when Katya comes back. So we should say that she comes back to Ivan's flat, and she is now 17 years old. And when she's taken, she's about 3. So, this is 39 to 50, 53-ish. And she's talking to Ivan, and she's explaining to him how much his wife meant to her. And she says over and over again, she didn't forget me. She didn't forget me. And so a lot of the film deals with this feeling, I think, not just on Katya's part, but I think the film implies that this feeling of abandonment is just widespread, right? And the ordinary claims, stuff that we take for granted, of the claims of the family are disrupted or I guess purposefully disrupted in a kind of dramatic way, right? If your husband is taken away from you and sent to the gulag, but the family was attacked in lots of less dramatic ways. And so people are constantly encouraged to forget other people, particularly their family members and friends. And Solzhenitsyn talks about this in the Gulag Archipelago, that sort of almost on a daily basis, in order to survive and prosper, you would have to have averted your eyes from some claim that we in the West would take for granted and what we would call kind of natural. And so it's just hard to kind of wrap your head around how important it would be to you to come across someone who would not forget you, who would embrace their connection and not forsake you no matter what. And ultimately, right, that's why I think Anastasia is such a powerful figure of nobility in the film, where, I mean, I guess from a kind of neutral standpoint, she doesn't do anything that dramatic, but nonetheless, she stands up as this picture of nobility in a way.
Yeah, her spontaneous show of love for this girl, which also means she's willing to brave all these dangers. She gets hired at the orphanage to care for the girl, but then she's caught. It turns out that somebody realizes that, they must be related because she loves this girl, and she's fired for it. And then she has to sneak in lying that she's the aunt. She does whatever she can because she realizes this is one thing that she cannot give up on, that she cannot live her life if she's not capable of loving a child. And that's you could say that's what's so heartbreaking about it. Her love is innocent, but it is also fatal.
Ken, I think maybe we can end there. We're at, I think, right about an hour. So maybe if we want to start to field questions, Titus and I would be happy to try to answer those.
Yeah, just you couldn't have planned the ending any better. I mean, that was perfect timing. So well done, both. So yeah, so just to get to a couple questions, just kind of want to just build on what you both had kind of highlighted with these two films is these themes of, dealing with a communist regime and communism in general, and especially with Stalin, is the things that you've mentioned several times are fear, violence, death, betrayal, abandonment. I mean, it's all there. And Titus, you mentioned when Stalin's his funeral, the mass casualty event that they had there, anywhere from 500 to 1,500 people died. And I think you had a good point. Was it out of love and adoration for this, this corpse, or was it, as you said, fear? And the fear, as we saw in these movies, of the proper response when you think Stalin, in the death of Stalin, when he's almost, they can't decide if he's alive or dead. And when they think he might have a spark of life left, they have to show how happy they are that this guy is rebounded, or to show the extent of their sorrow. So you wonder if part of that was with those group of people massing at the thing, trying to one up each other in their expression of their sorrow, so they won't be considered an enemy and they're responding properly. What the society does to people, and the staying power that you mentioned, Flag, of Stalin. Flag and I were teaching in an event a couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned during my travels, both in Russia and in Ukraine, late in the early 2000s and even 2017, 18, that you go to these countries and you still see people with Stalin posters and not condemning the man, but we're still worshiping this guy after all these years and after everything that we know, which kind of leads me to, I guess, the first question. Given that, you can think of the movies and the themes that we have. Could we imagine anybody making a light, dark comedy about the death of Hitler or Pol Pot in the manner that they did the death of Stalin in this day and age? So I guess our first question, kind of points to that. So why do you think the death of Stalin was so popular with the critics and with a good chunk of our population?
I'll take a crack at that. I don't think I have a very sophisticated answer. I think Titus had mentioned this in his remarks on the movie. I don't think I did, but it is a very sleek and polished movie. It's very easy to watch. In a way, I think it's well edited, even though the plot doesn't move. There's no reason why, scene 3 follows scene 2 in my view. But it's very sleek and very polished, in that it has these bright colors. The acting is funny. Lots of people point to Jason. I think it's Jason Isaac, the guy who plays Zhukov, as being funny, and he's sort of bombastic. So visually, it's a very arresting film. As I said, there are these moments that are very funny. Steve Buscemi as Khrushchev is funny in that scene with his wife, and periodically, his acting skills are put on display. So I guess I suspect it was popular because people, for the reason that Titus gives, it's safe to make fun of Stalinism now. So we think, because kind of everyone knows that Stalinism is bad. But I guess I think people were deceived by the kind of smoothness, the polish of it, the fact that it had all these wonderful actors in it. And I think they kind of missed the fact that there wasn't much to it. And I think conservatives almost universally liked it, with the exception of Kyle Smith. I saw his review in National Review this morning, and he didn't hate it like Titus and I did, but he certainly didn't love it. And he expressed some reservations, especially about the Berea stuff and sort of crossing lines about not making fun of things that aren't funny. But I think conservatives liked it because finally, there are these movies that are making fun of this thing that we know is bad. But I think people were just sort of seduced into liking it because of that fact. And it's not, ultimately, it's this kind of shiny thing that looks like it's supposed to do what we like, but it just doesn't have much substance, I suppose. And maybe conservatives were happy too that this guy Iannucci, who's I presume is a man of the respectable left, he was making fun of Stalin. So that's my guess. But again, I think people were distracted and kind of missed the miss the emptiness of it. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Titus.
I think that's very well said. I have very little to add. Perhaps these two things. One of them is that conservatives are desperate for glamour, desperate for celebrity occasions of their own. And here was this big event made by liberals for liberals, but which conservatives could participate in, finally. And I think that's why they jumped on it. I don't think otherwise they would have, because it's so indecent. But celebrity often wins out, does it not? The other problem, I think, has to do with the indecency itself. I think people, long drawn out fart jokes around the corpse of Stalin are funny to a certain sensibility. I think this is what is sometimes called liking something ironically, when people pretend they don't like something that they do like. The shock that it's the corpse of Stalin, never before seen on film, and it's also these people making these scabrous jokes, which are supposedly only for teenagers to enjoy. That shows that I think the audience is far less mature than it seems. I think people like trash, and this gave them an opportunity to not only like it, but to applaud themselves as sophisticated people who know history and politics and who can get the references, while indulging in the more disgusting forms of humor. It's unfortunate, but there it is. There's people like Yanucci have a talent for bringing this out of people, that secretly they don't have good taste and they don't really care that much about decency in such concerns. And all they need is an excuse, because it's sufficiently polished. The cast is sufficiently famous. It shows up in festivals, not just in theaters, and it is talked about in the precincts of the liberal elite. Unfortunately, these things still have quite an attraction.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and I think it speaks a little bit to the state of our education, where you people don't really understand. They see Beria as somebody who's bad, but they don't see the guy was a mass murderer and a serial rapist. I mean, you just don't get much lower than that. As was the regime in total was not much better. So along that same theme, going back to the death of Stalin, so the interesting question was, if you were going to remake the death of Stalin, not as a comedy, how would you guys suggest remaking that movie to actually portray it, the true nature of communism? What would the two directors here in front of us today, how would they go about creating this masterpiece?
Yikes. I mean, I'm a boring professor. I know nothing about how to make a movie. I mean, I guess I would say talk to Andrei Konchalovsky and use the inner circle. More seriously, I would say you have to make a movie that might include, if not highlight, the claims of the private, right? I mean, so that's a really interesting question. What were some of the members of the inner circle like in private, and how did they navigate their private life? In addition to actually, running a country, what did they think about Stalin? I mean, I'm sure biographies have been written about most of these people, right? Was their attachment to Stalin and their admiration of him genuine, right? Had they struggled with Stalin when they were young men in the 1920s, right? I mean, there are all sorts of kind of interesting biographical stories that you might link to the death of Stalin. So I guess I would, if I were to remake the movie, I might pick maybe one or two people from that inner circle and kind of investigate their relationship to the man, from early on, maybe when Lenin was still alive, and see how that relationship developed. So that's just one idea.
I think there's a lot to that idea, that you'd have to get the characterization right for the Politburo, and you'd have to look at this matter seriously. I think you say, there is something that is absurdly funny in the death of Stalin. Some of what you see in the movie is true. crazy, chaotic, cowardly reactions. But I think the movie cheapens out. It's made by people who are essentially cowards, who suddenly get the courage to say, "Look, Stalin is dead, and all these people around him are scared. Who's the tyrant now? Who's the tough guy now?" The tough guy is never this kind of a fit liberal. Never. There is no possibility. You can't find somebody worse from that point of view. How do you have the right to laugh at this? But I think for people who are morally serious and fairly well educated as to the Soviet Union, yes, there is on the one hand something funny in the cowardly, confused reactions. And it is an occasion to reveal certain weaknesses in the regime. People were terrified. If you read what people like Khrushchev and so on said later, you'd see how terrified people had been of Stalin. And that is to say, part of the humor is that from a certain point of view, I don't know why the movie did not get this. I'm not saying I'm particularly original here, but maybe it's because these people are mediocrities. Everybody else, I think, would notice that from a certain point of view, Khrushchev and so on were the same as the lowest slave in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Everybody was terrified. They were all afraid of the next purge that would come for them. And the movie, even when it looks at the banishment to Siberia of Molotov's wife, it doesn't even get that this is the funny point, that from a certain point of view, Molotov is a slave, just like anybody else.
Yeah.
This is the exact same terror and all the glamour and the glitter, and his name is on the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and he was Minister of Foreign Affairs. It doesn't matter. Everybody serves at the pleasure of a tyrant who enjoys being willfully cruel. And of course, this, by the way, this is pointed out in the inner circle. The cruelties that Stalin indulged in before servants with ministers and etc. And that's a very important thing to have realized, and it would be a certain source of comedy. But of course, you'd have to also admit that communism stayed communism for a good 4 decades. Well, almost, I guess. This was not over because Stalin was dead, and the people after him were not less tyrannical. They're the people who put down the Hungarian Revolution in blood, or eventually put down the Prague Spring, and eventually invaded Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So these were not funny people compared to Stalin. The fear isn't over, in fact. Perhaps insisting on that, the way in which tyranny debases even the people right next to the tyrant, or perhaps especially them, since they're the most highfalutin, they're the most pretentious, and in certain ways, of great importance, politically, historically, that there's something to that. But of course, overall, the situation isn't funny. The communists won. The tyranny was not over. Communism was not over with Stalinism. Perhaps pointing out that is a kind of perpetual slavery for these people too. They used to be slaves to Stalin, now they are slaves to a regime that they cannot escape themselves either. That, I think, is part of what you were saying, Flag, cutting people down to size, cutting down some of the pretense of power of human beings. That if they had shown enough about communism to see that they are too stuck in this regime, that they are now a kind of oligarchic tyranny, the Politburo, or Khrushchev is the wannabe Stalin, but they're all stuck with this and none of them can or will escape it.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a kind of a great segue into our next question too, is that, in both the movies, you saw this constant fear of being the next victim. And I think the one scene in the Death of Stalin that I thought they did a pretty good job with was in the apartment building when the trucks came to grab the next set of victims out of the apartment. So everybody's laying in bed, everybody's like, in fear, is it going to be me this time? And or putting on extra clothes because they could be heading to the gulag, so they want to stay warm. So it shows different strata. So you got the upper level within the inner circle who are afraid too. They don't know if they're going to be next, like Molotov's wife. or the common person. So what forget, what do you think is most effective in telling the story from, a movie making perspective, or just telling the story in general? Is it focusing on the common person, or focusing on that higher level of the inner circle of these regimes to see that the fear is there as well? What do you think is most effective in conveying the real nature of communism?
I guess I would say it has to be a little of both. Or I suppose I would say the easiest way to go would be to make sure it's a little of both, because as Titus suggested earlier, it's the perspective of these ordinary people that you are seeing, seeing the world from in the inner circle, which sort of negates any temptation to cynicism. And that's why I think the beginning, the opening scene in Death of Stalin is so brilliant. I mean, it's laugh out loud funny to see this guy answering this phone call and trying to figure out with his colleague what to do, and then going out into the street to get more people, the peasants who happen to be walking around to try to get the applause right. I mean, that is just so well done. And so to the extent that you can, as Titus suggested, connect that to the fact that even the the people second, third in command in relation to Stalin experienced this same phenomenon, precisely because Stalin is so unpredictable. He had all of these purges before. So I guess my recommendation would be to do a little bit of both, and that in a way is kind of the decisive fact about living under a Mao or under a Stalin, is everyone is kind of reduced to this servile, insane, performative way of life that you can't escape. You want to add anything, Titus?
Sure. I think you're right about the mixture, because somehow you have to convey the fact that ordinary people are enslaved, but you'd think that the guy who goes to meet an American general or president is somehow his correlative. He is also somehow free. Surely Eisenhower had many fears, but not that Roosevelt would ever have him shot. So presumably Zhukov is in the same situation. No, he is not. This is, again, one of the many, many mistakes that Yanucci made in the Death of Stalin. If he had told the truth, it would have been much better. Zhukov was nobody in 1953. Stalin, out of jealousy that this guy had been the savior general of the fatherland in propaganda and to an extent in reality, had him banished to some small nowhere place. Molotov was in disgrace, so on and so forth. That it would have been much more effective, I believe, to show that these people who had been world historical, as our Marxist friends say, in World War II, were banished like the last guy, in any perjury, in any arrest. So it's very important to show that compared to the tyrant, the difference between the people at the top and the people at the bottom isn't really relevant. Not with that is to say, not with respect to these fundamental things. Are you safe? Is your wife safe? Are you the one pulling the trigger or the one facing down the barrel of the gun? It turns out they're both. And that, I think, is worth learning. I think that's worth knowing. I think it shows something very important about tyranny. And in a way, I think it would be good to as an education about the character of tyranny as such. One of the delusions surrounding communism was that it could be rational, it could be effective, it could make for some kind of decision making that, granted, it would have to be very cruel. You just have to calculate rationally and throw humanity to the side, but it would work. But instead, it created a tyranny more capricious than most tyrannies. And even the very effective people, precisely because they were effective, were often punished or sometimes destroyed out of jealousy. And that this could never really stop. That is to say, it's important to be honest, unlike the Death of Stalin, that the Soviets ran a good chunk of the world and threatened the world with annihilation for a good 70 years. That's not nothing. It's an astonishing achievement, if a terrifying achievement. But the delusions, so to speak, that people could rationalize government, that you could rationalize politics and have a scientific attitude, be managers rather than rulers of men. No, that didn't work out. What you had was one tyranny after another, some more oligarchic, some more capricious, and all of them driven not only by conflicts, but by people whose failures affected the hundreds of millions of their slaves. So I think that that is what I suppose is sometimes called the human element, but it is not something all that funny. It's a failure that led to all this suffering, to all these cruelties, to all this madness. You could say that the failures of these people drove millions mad.
And you could have made I think a funny movie just about the director of the Moscow radio or concert hall, and sort of show him trying to do these ridiculous things to satisfy Stalin and going home to his wife and try to explain, what happened and all of that. And then sort of show him, a couple years after the death of Stalin, when everyone now is or after Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, when now suddenly everyone knows that Stalin is bad, right? And you can't say anything nice about Stalin. So you could sort of point to the absurdities of the deaths of Stalin through a kind of micro portrait of someone trying to manage the before and the after, what changed, what's different, maybe something like that.
Yeah, I think it's all good points. I think we got time for two last questions. So I think we know the answer to the first half of the segment, which is the question was, how realistic were the plots in these movies? Obviously, Death of Stalin, we know not very, but the Inner Circle, I think that's more to the point. How realistic was the plot in that particular film?
Well, I'll let Titus take this for the most part, but it's based on a true story. I guess I'm not quite sure how faithful it is in every detail, but this projectionist did exist. And Titus, do you know anything more about the details of this?
The essentials are right. Obviously, when you watch the movie, you will be able to tell that some things are, dramatized, perhaps sentimentalized. I am myself not sentimental, so I pick up on some things and am a little annoyed. But the essentials are true.
Okay, good. And the last question, since we've talked about this, it's kind of hard to do comedy or satire right with this topic. So if there is a film that you think that you gentlemen feel does satire right with the topic of communism, what would you recommend to the audience? And then also for the whole period around Stalin, what go-to movies would you recommend to get the real picture of this?
The comedy one is tough.
Yeah,
I haven't seen it in a long time. Titus, you and I talked about it, I think, when we did our podcast on Death of Stalin, but the Mel Brooks movie 12 Chairs is, I would say, certainly better than Death of Stalin, but not a dramatic success. What would you say about that?
It's a pretty funny movie. It's not very good, but it is based on two novels that are very, very good. The 12 Chairs and The Golden Calf, written by this pair of Soviet writers, Ilf and Petrov. They have been translated into English, so they're available to readers. They follow a kind of mad world plot where these guys go running around the Soviet Empire in the early years. It's in the 20s. After a fortune hidden in a chair that was sold off after an estate was sold. And that gives them the chance to see all sorts of parts of the Soviet Union and run into all sorts of situations where you see, to the extent possible through censorship, how terrible the situation was everywhere. And it's pretty dark comedy, but not, I think, as unpleasant as Death of Stalin. And it's a very good picture made by people in the 30s. about the early days of the Soviet regime. I think I'm not sure there's a better satire of that in print, and there's none in the movies.
Okay. And any go-to just dramas or historically accurate portrayals of the Stalin era that you guys would recommend?
I would certainly rank Inner Circle pretty high on the list. I'm trying to think. Titus, anything jump out at you right away?
I mean, the most harrowing perhaps is the 1994 movie, by Nikita Mikhalkov, Burnt by the Sun. It's about the purges of the 30s. Mikhalkov is, by the way, the brother of Andrei Konchalovsky, and he's also a very famous director in Russia. I think, Flag, you are more competent than I am to speak about Life and Fate, the novel and then TV show by Grossman.
Yeah, the TV show I thought was pretty interesting. Now I'm blanking on where it's available. It used to be available on Amazon Prime, but this Vasily Grossman novel, Life and Fate, set around the Battle of Stalingrad, sort of a massive 800-page novel. And so the makers of this TV series sort of pulled a couple of the plot lines out of that massive novel and made what I thought was a pretty competent portrayal of life in World War II under Stalin. Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, thank you both so much for the education we've got today on these two films. I think we know which one the winner is. That's why I think the Inner Circle is definitely the one you should of these two to really pay attention to. So again, on behalf of both Flag and Titus, we thank you for tuning in to watch. If you're looking for more information about communism, specifically the victims of communism, go to our website at victimsofcommunism.org, and you can find on the resources page a lot of information about the true story behind the victims of communism. And also, as a nonprofit, we're always looking for help to tell these stories. So click the red donate button and give us a hand if you feel inclined to do so. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time when we do Communism and Film.